Great, now that we're good to go, firstly, I'd just like to remind everyone, please time yourselves. I'll only post in the chat once you go over 7 minutes and 15 seconds. Please also keep an eye on the chat for POIs. If you prefer verbal POIs, you can just state that at the start of your speech. And apologies for the delay. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Prime Minister.
All right, just confirm y'all can hear me. Fantastic. As Catherine said, POIs in the chat, please, and time yourselves. So I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to make it very clear what we think this motion means by celebrate. Insofar as we think broadly, as the LGBT community, we think this is a good thing. When asked about it, we will say that it is good. When people ask leaders or people within the LGBT community for porn sources or where they recommend to look into this, we say, do it on OnlyFans, do it on these types of platforms, don't do it via platforms like Pornhub. This is more accurate, more reflective. We think this is a better source. I'm gonna have 2 main, if there's a clarification on that, I'd love to take one when I hit the time. 2 main things in the speech. Firstly, why the porn industry broadly is bad for actors within the industry, and secondly, why this is a better experience for viewers. Going to go into this right now. Firstly, why is the porn industry yeah, we think like also the comparative is if we don't celebrate this, viewers are more likely, or porn consumers are more likely to go to sources like Pornhub instead of sources like OnlyFans or the other examples that would fit into this motion. We think that is a worse thing. I'm going to explain that why. No clarifications, cool. Why porn industry is bad for actors. We think in the porn industry, you are extremely replaceable as an actor. You have very little control over the things that the industry tells you to do. So for example, if your boss tells you you have to do X, Y, Z thing and you don't feel comfortable doing it, you have very little recourse to say no, because if you do say no, you are likely to be kicked out of that specific acting gig, but also not be rehired later on for other ones, which means that you get the reputation that you are a bad actor or you are an actor that is messy to work with. Means is in these situations, actors are more pressured to say yes and to consent to things that they are extremely uncomfortable with. We think that it is really problematic, and that is coercing people within the industry to make choices and make decisions that they wouldn't necessarily make. And we think that in of itself is a bad thing. And as the LGBT community, or as any other community, we think that we should try to make this less prevalent, or like replace this as much as possible. Secondly, insofar as the types of porn that the industry does, is it forces people to play out the porn star fantasy. And insofar as this means is that even if I am a lesbian porn star, what I am going to do in order to, and what the industry's incentive is to make me also be in some like threesome porn, some like 2 women, 1 man porn. We think that is really negative because A, I don't feel comfortable, and B, I am forced to play out the fantasies of what is heteronormative and things that aren't my opinion and aren't what I feel comfortable doing in porn, just to maintain the specific incentive structure of the industry and to play into the heteronormative gazes that exist there. And we think that this is also very, very negative for the actors there and for the perception of what is and isn't authentically gay or authentically lesbian, or whatever your identity and whatever you're billed as being as the actress. What is the comparative there? We think that you got more control over the types of porn that you produce or / act in. You have more ability to leave and say no to things when you're put in a situation where you're more likely to feel comfortable, because you have more alternatives where you can turn to in order to stay in the industry. You have better working conditions because you are more able to control for that, because you are more able to leave. You have more control over the setup and the fantasy that you are playing out in this. So for all of these reasons, we already think that leaving or having more opportunities within the porn industry that is not just the porn like TM, like the porn industry, is better. Why is this better though for viewers? Because we think that porn is a learning vehicle. People learn what sexuality is and how sexuality works through learning porn, watching porn. This is because oftentimes sexual activity is not something that is taught about, not explicitly in schools or in any other forums. So when people get their first exposure to what porn looks like or what sex is supposed to look like, this is oftentimes through porn. When you are like ages 10 or whatever, when you want to know what sex is, you Google what is sex, or you Google porn, and that's how you find it online, and those videos is how you perceive what porn is and what porn is meant to be like, what your actions are meant to be like, the things you're meant to be into. Insofar as we think that the porn industry is more reflective of specific stereotypes and specific like categorizations of what it's meant to cater to, both insofar as it caters more to heteronormative gazes. So even its depictions of LGBTQ porn is more heteronormative. For example, we see that there are a lot of lesbian porn are depictions of women scissoring, but any lesbian knows scissoring is the weirdest fucking concept ever, and it can only be thought of by a hetero man, right? Like what? And so then young lesbians see this and think that porn is supposed to be doing this, and what the actions of sex is meant to be scissoring. And when they grow up and they actually try to have their first sexual experiences, this is what they try, this is what they fail. I'll take closing opposition.
Yeah, but the issue is that OnlyFans and other similar pay-per-view like platforms are never going to be the thing that people see as their first representation of porn, because as a young person with no dispensable income, you can't like buy an OnlyFans subscription.
So I think that like platforms such as OnlyFans are likely to rise and likely to become more accessible as time goes on and as they garner more and more attraction. I think that when this is what you are told to go watch, and you are told that this is where gay porn is, you are more likely to purchase these things. You're more likely to like have a friend be like, hey, if you want to do this. You're more likely to have the open house, the LGBT community center have their own accounts and be able to show you things like this. And we think that this is all really good shit. Lastly, I think that we get a better reflection of the process of queer sex on these types of websites. So for example, on sites like Pornhub, you don't have an accurate reflection. What does this mean? This means that there aren't things like gay men douching before they're having sex, right? There aren't things like this, like whitewashing the experience of what sex is like, is meant to be like. What this is, why this is problematic is because when people start doing sex, they don't realize that these things are integral parts of these sexual experiences. And they don't realize that this is something they're meant to do. So they have, in order for to have a good sexual first experience, they need to be extremely lucky and have sex with someone who's already had sex and already had these specific experiences in order to be able to do safe sex. And when you have queer actors and queer narratives that are portrayed by queer like producers, you're more likely to have scenarios that are more explicit about things like douching, things like women don't actually scissor, and this is only things to please the male gaze. And there's only, for all these reasons, we think that we would rather have queer people go to these alternative sites versus the current porn complex. For all these reasons, propose.
Right, we thank that speaker for their speech. I'd now like to welcome Leader of Opposition.
Panel, what has driven the rise of amateur porn is an idea within the queer community that is quite hegemonic, that the liberation of sexuality necessarily has to be one in the public gaze, necessarily has to be recorded and shared in a way that's hyper-visible, and the politics of which is incredibly vulnerable. I think the queer community can go and take a heterogeneous approach to this. That's to say, some people have OnlyFans, some people don't, and we should not celebrate either one, and nor should we make value judgments. Rather, we should say that each choice has its own situational validity, and here are your options, but we make no judgments whether or not you go to OnlyFans or something else, because I don't even think OnlyFans is all the time better, or even over 50% of the time better in the way they have described in OG. That is to say, I do not think most lesbian OnlyFans are an instructional video, or most gay porn is an instructional video in which you start from the douching stage, and then you get the more realistic depiction, is that you get ghosted and then you finally eat pizza because you have starved yourself all day in order to not shit on a dick. I think more importantly here is that OnlyFans porn necessarily drives towards a consumer base and has the same kind of drivers, but without any of the regulatory burden. And that is going to be the largest push in our case. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is what drives amateur porn and the rise of amateur porn and why we should not celebrate that specific rise. The first thing to say here is that per the introduction, the economics behind that and the liberation behind that is what has driven it, that people believe there's a liberation of their sexuality to put it online. I think this is a misnomer in that people can have private sexualities and there's not a articulation of shame within the queer community. Secondarily, that this liberation necessarily does not have to be commodified. That's to say, you can be a sex therapist or you can share these ideals within your community, but it should not be in an OnlyFans platform or an online platform in a way that's amateur pornography, but rather shared through things like stories or things like explanations online, because amateur pornography is very particular in that it seeks to have the most views, it seeks to make the most money, and the platforms on which it thrives has the algorithmic incentive structure to do this, because in order to host all that pornography, you need to pay for your service, right? Which means either you need to drive ad revenue through your algorithms, which is why the types of occurrences occur that they describe. Things like scissoring do not occur because scissoring occurs because, like they said, because of the heterosexual gaze. But we tell you that's driven by the fact that no matter what platform you are on, amateur or not, the algorithms drive you towards that. But secondarily, on monetization, that the most profits are made from heterosexual men. So, sorry, OG, you are outnumbered in the monetary sense, so you are always not going to be pandered to as a consumer, which means the monetized pornography sector is not going to garner to you the things you want, nor is the paid pornography and professional. So, secondarily, why is the trade-off so bad if it is the trade-off with paid pornography? And this is taking the case at their best, though I will later contest this premise as a trade-off with professional pornography. The first thing to note here is that the trade-off is actually bad because they assert, well, porn companies can be abusive and make you do things you do not want. But by and large, there is a small minority because firstly, government regulation can actually regulate public-facing pornography companies because they are institutionalized companies that are beholden to each director they choose. Secondarily, professionalization means that there are multiple actors there. There's the lighting director, there's the director, there's the camera person, in which you get more and more legal infrastructure to garner consent. Secondarily, more witnesses. And third, you actually have a history of working with that. I think abuse happens more on OnlyFans type platforms because when you collaborate with an individual, you do not know their true actual history of legal infrastructure. You do not know what they have done in the past. And secondarily, I think you can much more easily target an individual who is in a more vulnerable state to be on OnlyFans because there are the lack of regulations that exist. And that means for harms like underage sex, harms like individuals being exploited are more likely on these amateur porn sites where you do not have the legal infrastructure. And ultimately, there's very little political will to focus on OnlyFans and these structures because there is not the same regulatory burden, because the types of things that happen there. And obviously, this outweighs all the harms they talk about because I have shown you structural analysis as to why the infrastructure of professional porn works better. So, independent of that, what are the sexual discourses that come forward? Because they tell you in the status quo, there are very stagnant sexual discourses in which hegemonic heteronormative values are the dominant force. But those are the dominant force on either side, as I told you, because there are the pushes on both sides on the monetary and algorithmic space. But I actually think professional porn is uniquely good at breaking the hegemonic grip. Why? The first reason why is that we change the discourse when we are agnostic within the queer community. That's to say, we send the communal signals all together as to what we want. That's to say, we can demand that companies are not just ones that hire twinks or white people or individuals that we do not see in our, who are the majority in a sociological sense, but obviously do not represent the majority of individuals. But secondarily, I think the majority of experiences come to the forefront when you move away from amateur porn, because amateur porn necessarily has to fight towards a bottom line. That's to say, the profit margins of OnlyFans is obviously much smaller than that of a professional pornography company. For the fact, professional pornography companies can cross-subsidize from their more popular genres to their more niche genres, and can use the economies of scale to lower their costs. That means it's more likely to produce the type of porn that fits towards a gay niche that ultimately ends up being able to make more money for them and be able to give more better sexual discourses. But ultimately, I put educational sort of porn day one, in which is not scissoring but purely romantic. The first reason why is that porn is a fantasy, that is to say, it is not purely representational. And if you are looking for an instruction video, I'm sorry, OG, but you're just not going to find it. But lastly here is that the discourses, in order to move towards the ones they want, that is more representative porn, necessarily has to happen when we are more open and less dependent on these amateur porn sites. Very proud to oppose.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I now like to welcome Deputy Prime Minister.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Great. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. My speech is going to talk about a little what we think that the LGBTQIA community, henceforth the community, because, you know, speech time shortening of things is better. So what we think the community should be doing and what its most ultimate responsibility is towards people who identify within that community, which is supporting and empowering those people. But before that, a few minute points of rebuttal. So we had a few things on what drives the round of amateur porn, and it's the liberation of sexuality to put it online. We just don't necessarily think this is true. We think a lot of what drives amateur porn is specifically the community's amateur porn is people who didn't feel they were represented and who didn't feel like they had that when they were needing to consume porn, and therefore are doing this as a part of their ideology. We think both possibilities are true, but definitely not necessarily the characterization we get coming out of OO. And notice that we don't need to celebrate in a way that pushes people to put their sexuality online, but rather to consume what it is that they are basing their sexuality off of on OnlyFans and amateur porn. Notice amateur porn on Pornhub entirely on our side of this motion, still amateur porn, it's fine, as opposed to going to more produced porn in other places. But second of all, the claim that it doesn't have to be commodified and you can give stories and explanations outside of the porn world. We think that it's not mutually exclusive and we can support both, but also we think we should directly support these kinds of things happening in porn specifically, because we think that's where people get the perception of what is sexy. And that is the point where they connect things with sexual gratification. So what I watch while I am sexually gratifying myself is what my brain is also going to connect with what I need the process to be when I'm searching for sexual gratification with other people. That means that if douching is not represented in a situation where I am experiencing sexual gratification, and scissoring is, that is what my expectation when seeing other people is going to be. So it's important that this also happens within the porn realm and not only in sharing stories in a purely instructional way. Then we get a point on like still profit incentives, and the majority of people are straight men, and therefore we're still going to pander to straight men. But notice that the profit incentives are different, because here I have people who are actually actively subscribing to my channel as opposed to me needing many people to go in to see ads. These are two different things, because then I have a client base that I want to be representative of and I want to be loyal to. This means that if I am creating LGBTQIA plus pornography on OnlyFans, I'm not going to be able to compete with people who have entirely straight and heteronormative fantasies. This means that I'm not actually going to actively try and pander to them, because I know I can't compete. What I am going to do is be loyal to my fan base who wants to consume the specific kind of content that I am creating, and therefore give them the kind of content that they want to see and will be representative of them and that they feel that they can identify in and that I think that they can learn the most from in that sense, which is why Sure, profit incentives still exist, but in this situation, profit incentives push me to create content that is more authentic and is more representative, and not a company that needs to continue to get people to click on my content or to buy it and needs to pander to the majority, which means that, yes, they are more likely to continue to pander to entirely straight heteronormative things, and they want to be able to get their money even when they're creating niche gay content, which is why even their niche gay content is going to be tainted by the heteronormative gaze. G-A-Z-E. Yes, just felt a second that needed to be clarified. Anyways, let's talk about the regulation and abuse point, right? Because the point here is that we need more regulation and more of a legal watchdog's eye when it comes to the porn industry because of the inherent power imbalance within that industry, and the fact that I have people who can tell me what I can and can't do and can hire me and not hire me that aren't the clients, aren't consumers, but other people deciding for me. When I don't have that, I need far less regulation because I have a lot more control about what I can and cannot do. This means that abuse might happen on both sides. I'm not saying that OnlyFans is a solution, but it's far less likely to happen when I don't feel pressured and I don't feel like my income is dependent on someone who is forcing me to do things I don't want to do. Notice underage sex, illegal no matter where it happens. People should, FBI looks into it no matter where it happens, shouldn't happen in any place. I don't think that OnlyFans allows this any more than, porn does in any way. So can people target people and can people still be less powerful? Yes, but do we think it happens to a far lesser extent? Yes, because of all of the reasons Rachel already gave you, which weren't engaged with. Let's talk about what we think the LGBTQIA community should be doing, regardless of the practical implications of this. We think that they should support people who identify as part of it, and not just support, but actively empower them. Why is this true? We think that the community, for many, is one of the only places that they have ever experienced this in their life. They have been either shunned or not accepted, or just like not 100% legitimized. And if you're bi, why don't you just choose to date men? Whether we're inside of the communities, that is the place they have to feel that kind of empowerment and to feel empowered in their choices, and no matter what they choose to be. It also is what makes it an active community, because I don't know, small groups of people exist in many different places, but what makes things a community is whether people feel like they are a part of it and feel empowered by it and want to continue interacting with it. But it's also what eventually gives it its strength, because the more people feel empowered in it, the more they want to be a part of it and be actively and be an active part of it, and not just a passive part of it. And I identify as bi and therefore I'm technically part of this community, but also I actively identify in it and I go to the protests and I vote based on this belief, etc. So it's what gives it its strength. Before I continue, I'll take closing.
Yeah, do you think that everyone who goes into the amateur porn industry would go into the traditional porn industry if it wasn't as celebrated?
I think most people who consume the amateur porn industry would consume the conventional porn industry on the alternative. So I think it's better for people to consume the porn that is better representative of them and is not actively harming the people who are inside of the industry. Let's talk about why you need to celebrate in order to support and empower. Look, even if the alternative isn't actively saying anything and trying to remain neutral and just silence, we think that is still a form of delegitimization. If someone is asked in an interview, what do you think about OnlyFans, and they remain silent or remain neutral, this feels like delegitimization. Small trigger warning coming up here. It's like my family not introducing me at public gatherings, or my grandmother not actively bringing me up or wanting to talk about me. This is silence, and it's not actively speaking out, but it still feels like delegitimization. So for many members who are consuming or want to consume OnlyFans, or who feel like this is the one place that reflects them, this is an active delegitimization when it's not actively celebrated and supported by people from the community. We think that given that this is what gives the community strength and its importance to these people, it is crucial that the community also celebrates and gives them the feeling that what they're feeling, what they identify with, and what makes them feel empowered is legitimate, and celebration is necessary for that. For those reasons, please propose.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I now like to welcome Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're good.
Look, looking towards pornography and the sexualization of each individual as a point of resistance for the queer community has been a fallacious one, because pornography is not innately liberatory, it's about the factors behind it. So the first question I'm going to begin the speech with is the profit incentive liberatory? They say that OnlyFans and the types of amateur porn allow you to carve out a niche, and therefore you can target audiences with pornography that is more representative of real queer experiences, because you can get a real community instead of hegemonic forces. You can make lesbian porn for lesbians instead of lesbian porn for straight people. I think the first thing to note here is, as I told you before, the economies of scale mean that the type of lesbian porn, there are always going to be larger companies that always make better lesbian porn than you for the types of targeted community. Firstly, because they can do the type of advertisement to those communities that are affected. Secondarily, is because they are able to monetize that more with a better cast, with more camera work, with more professional lighting. Like, most amateur porn has shit lighting, right? But it's independent of that. If you carve out that niche, it means you are more beholden to that specific niche. They can ask you to do more things, and that is more coercive. And it means each subscription within that community matters more, versus what I told you before, is that the porn company that falls under an umbrella, and one category is to produce realistic lesbian porn for a lesbian audience as a passion project, is able to be subsidized from the straight portion of that company to make money, because the profit margins are probably lower, and the ways in which you can lower your costs are by sharing a cameraman, by using those economies of scale, and sharing actors in a way that means you actually get more liberatory porn, because the profit margins are bigger for professional porn, and OnlyFans, you are beholden to that small community. They assert here that that small community is going to be woker and therefore implicitly going to be better, but that is not necessarily true, right? Just because someone has a more niche or more realistic or authentic identity does not mean they are more ethical in their consumption of porn. I think it's likely because they are in that small community and know that they have that disproportionate power by being such a large block of your revenue, by sending tips, by having such a disproportionate power, you're able to do more. And moreover, predators and other nefarious individuals can infiltrate that community in a way that perverts that profit incentive. So ultimately, they only look at profit from the side of who consumes. We look at profit from profit being consumption, being the demand, minus away from the supply costs that make up pornography. So ultimately, at the end of that, you are more likely to be coerced into making porn you do not want to make, and more likely to make porn towards a male gaze in your hardest time in order to break even. So the second question I want to ask in this speech is, what side has better checks and balances and regulations? Because the unfortunate factor in the production of pornography is oftentimes abuses happen. They say you have more autonomy because it is your own site and therefore better. But do you have real autonomy just because it's yourself? Because that is underlies a very specific iteration of amateur pornography, that you're only producing solos. But many amateur pornographers need to branch out to amplify their hold, because there are such a small amount of like people who consume their porn, either because they are a minority group or because they produce a very niche, as they talk about. And so it cannot just be solo pornography. And oftentimes they need to reach into their communities to more powerful members in order to, one, send out their link to everyday subscribers and follow accounts. Second, to collaborate with them in ways to expand your reach on other OnlyFans, which means you have a factor for abuse in that they have more there. The second thing they say here is, obviously some of this abuse is illegal, obviously, but that is also a symmetric argument for why pornography companies theoretically should not abuse their workers, because that is illegal. But here's the problem. Yes, underage pornography is illegal, but is the fact you don't have record keeping on amateur porn sites. You have no accountability. You do not have to photocopy and go into a government drive and put up those, because there are millions and millions of amateur pornographers and the government cannot check each. But to get a license as a licensed pornographer as a professional one, you obviously need a clean record of multiple pornographies made of legitimate actors, and you have multiple layers of accountability and legal thresholds that actually protect you. Thirdly here is that the government has not caught up to regulate the types of amateur pornographers, so you should not celebrate it. I'll take OG.
Yeah, so sure, maybe you don't have records, but you have a literal video of the people participating on OnlyFans that the FBI can access, and therefore I don't think it's significantly harder to track this kind of pornography on OnlyFans.
But you have to track like a million clips of pornography because you don't know which one's the underage person. So they obviously do not have that sort of resource. Last thing I'm going to talk about is what is the difference when you celebrate this and what is our stance? The first thing to say here is that our stance is not to have absolute silence, as they say, because like they said, silence just defaults to the status quo. Our answer to this is to say there are merits and demerits to OnlyFans and to give a realistic depiction and say you should consume what makes you comfortable and what makes you happy. And maybe you should not consume pornography to look for liberation and for expectation of realness. Because even if douching is real per OG's analysis, no one wants to see poop water just shoot out of an anus. Like, even someone who sees that as a realistic thing, I don't want to see it, even if I want to be quote unquote educated in it, which is the problem that underlies your case. They assume there is a desire within these communities to see the types of realistic depictions, but oftentimes we are conditioned with hegemonic forces to not consume that, to see it as disgusting and gross, and to stigmatize it within ourselves and internalize problematic norms, which is ultimately why we cannot look to pornography for liberation, and the queer community should steer out of that completely and be agnostic and say, look, you are not going to find liberation on Pornhub or OnlyFans. Look elsewhere. We do not take a position on this. Someone performing on it, someone consuming of it is independently apolitical, and therefore we should not have the types of expectation OG has in going into that. Very proud to oppose.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I now like to welcome the member of government.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, perfect. Please put POIs in the chat if you have any. I'll do my best to check. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, firstly, a couple pieces of framing. I think right off the bat, we largely agree with OG's characterization that the modern porn industry through studios is largely predatory. I think, however, OG has missed out on a really important piece of nuance regarding the specific market conditions of modern porn, which is the fact that the most popular categories currently are those involving racialized individuals. In the majority of cases, the category that is like the most popular is like Asian, for example, right? But I think as they successfully pointed out, the majority of profits flow to production companies. I think the nuance that they miss out on, however, is that the dynamic here is one in which we have racialized bodies putting in significant labor, but the majority of the profits flowing towards white people and oftentimes straight people, right? So I think that is an important piece of nuance that us on CG are going to be addressing more directly. I think secondarily, where we're going to diverge more radically from OG is the idea of what we hope to get out of this, right? I think the most important thing that we're going to bring to this round is the idea that the organization of advocacy within the queer community has traditionally been on the basis of sexuality, right? So there's a couple of reasons for this. I think firstly, there's this idea that like what unites queer community is the idea that we have a marginalized sexuality, right? That is the idea of this acronym of LGBTQIA+, right? I think like, for example, if I am an Asian person trying to seek more Asian people, I'm likely to go to like an Asian culture event. I think similarly, because the queer community is a community that is organized on the basis of sexuality, it is therefore intuitive that platforms such as OnlyFans, wherein you explore sexuality, serve as the basis for organization and advocacy, right? I think the second important aspect of this is the historical precedent of survival sex work in the queer community, right? I think especially for racialized and marginalized people within the queer community, survival sex work has traditionally been a method through which they've been able to get capital, right? Oftentimes these people are unable to achieve capital through other means, such as getting a quote unquote normal job, and therefore resort to sex work. I think largely the modern derivation of this, which is through OnlyFans, is largely a continuation of this. So therefore it is a continuation of this historical dynamic, right? Those are the two important pieces of framing we're bringing to this round. Two main points for you today. Firstly, why is this good for sex workers and good for queer advocacy, and secondly, a little bit more on the impacts broader in the queer community. Firstly, on the idea of why is this good for sex workers? So I think when we look at the power of production, what OG misses out on a little bit is the fact that the majority of people who work in production are those who have had like experience working first as sex workers, right? But I think largely there has been like a problem with the funnel currently, which is that like white production managers oftentimes are the ones that are in places of power within these particular porn studios, right? I think at the point at which you have more people of color who are able to advocate for themselves, work within their own communities, and therefore form those linkages, you're able to have people that work in large production companies, right? So therefore, the type of disadvantages that O brings up in terms of organization are mitigated at the point at which you have a significant community of people who are able to mobilize these types of experiences in a way that is able to get like better camera quality, for example. I think secondarily, and the point that we're going to focus a lot more on is the importance of OnlyFans as a mechanism for alternative employment, right? I think an important thing to recognize is the type of queer people who are able to access mainstream acceptance are likely those to be white or wealthy, right? I think, for example, if I'm able to get a job like a lawyer or a doctor, for the most part, I'm able to achieve mainstream acceptance as a queer person, right? But I think, unfortunately, the reality for a lot of queer people, especially if you're a marginalized or racialized group, is that this is simply not an option for you, or it is a much tougher option for you, right? So I think in the majority of these instances, a lot of these people resort to sex work, right? Survival sex work is a phenomenon that I think we have to address, right? So I think at that point, it is incumbent upon us as a queer community to uplift these people and try to support them the best we can, right? I think OnlyFans, as we mentioned before, is a distinctly less predatory mechanism than Pornhub, for example, right? At the point at which you have profits flowing directly to these creators, you're able to distribute income in a way that is much more equitable than if you were to support these porn studios, right? So I think therefore, at the point at which we as a queer community are more willing to support these people at OnlyFans, essentially what we do is we're able to support the more vulnerable members of the community who oftentimes resort to survival sex work as a means of survival, right? I think secondarily, at the point at which us as queer activists in the queer community are able to gain more visibility and validity for these people, we're able to secure better protections for them, right? At the point at which we recognize that there's a historical precedent of people working within these industries to survive, we're able to make that an integral part of our activism, right? We're able to say, these are important members of the community and they deserve better protections. They deserve laws regulating their particular practice, and they deserve more protections in terms of the legal system, right? So I think these are distinctly large impacts in terms of activism that are largely missed out on front half that we are very glad to bring up on back half, right? So I think secondarily, when we look at the idea of the queer community, there's some pretty significant clash here that we're going to make with OO, right? So I think the thing that OO misses out on is that a main difference in the audience that you have when you work at OnlyFans versus Pornhub is the idea of creating a subscriber base, right? When you have an OnlyFans, essentially what you do is you have to try and get subscribers who are willing to pay every single month to access your content, right? The alternative on Pornhub is that you film one video for a studio. You don't necessarily have to create any connection with your followers, right? Because they simply click on your video and they just like leave, right? There's no connection there. But I think at the point at which you have an OnlyFans platform, what you're more likely to do is you're more likely to appeal to people that you think are going to come back month to month, right? So I think this largely clashes with what OO says is the harm of like continuing pandering, right? I think this is a unique mechanism through which you avoid this idea of continuing to pander to the heterosexual community, and is also secondarily a mechanism for better community building, right? So I think another important thing to recognize here is that at the point at which you're able to garner capital for these marginalized people, it doesn't necessarily have to stop here, right? A lot of people who formerly work as sex workers retire in older age, and what they end up doing is opening other businesses, right? They open up like hair salons, they open up other things, they put their capital towards use that benefits their community tangibly, right? Like I think another example of this is like the cock destroyers, like Sophie Anderson. Like she got really famous and then she started the show called Slag Wars, where she hired other queer actors, right? So I think there's a lot of ways when you are able to mobilize capital towards queer people that they are then able to use these forward languages to then, uplift more queer people, right? But the key mechanism here is that OnlyFans is a uniquely beneficial way through which we're able to redistribute income in a way that is much more equitable, right? So I think secondarily, an important thing is that, as I mentioned before, because we're able to create better connections through an idea like OnlyFans, because you have to create subscribers rather than just viewers, you also create a unique ability to sort of form a persona publicly and form a persona for advocacy, right? When you have an OnlyFans, because you have to focus on this personal connection, you're more likely to have more loyal subscribers rather than just viewers, right? At the point at which this is possible, you're now more able to make activism on stuff like Twitter. Like if you have a lot of followers who follow you because they really like you to subscribe month to month, month, rather than just sort of like clicking on your videos on Pornhub. You're more likely to be able to have a connection to those followers and influence them more, right? Because this is true, you're able to advocate for queer issues more, right? And I think as a queer community, at the point at which we uplift these people, we uplift these voices, because now they have access to a unique mechanism of greater connection, we're able to activate better advocacy, more engaged advocacy overall, right? So I think fundamentally, because we strategically take a stance that is more focused on queer activism rather than just viewing pleasure, we out-impact our OG and clash very significantly with OO. Thank you so much.
Right, we thank that speaker for their speech. I now like to welcome the member of opposition.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Fantastic. Top half goes as follows. Opening governments say that traditional porn industries are bad. Opening opposition say that they could be good if regulated. What we're going to do in closing opposition is prove that only on our side of the house is it possible to regulate traditional porn platforms, and they get better because we include LGBT activism in that and therefore take it over the top half on that basis. Before I move on, I'm going to have 2 points of rebuttal to the case that we heard out of closing government. The first one is on the idea of survival sex work. The problem with the debate so far has mostly been that this isn't really on the motion, right? Like the motion isn't whether or not OnlyFans is better than Pornhub. The motion is, should the LGBT movement support, or celebrate OnlyFans, right? So it's unclear to me why that this celebration is crucial to people that do survival sex work, right? Like clearly, like even if OnlyFans is slightly stigmatized, if you literally need this money to survive and you know that OnlyFans is better, like it's unclear why, LGBT support is so crucial to you, not doing this thing that you literally need, for your survival. The second thing is the idea that you can uplift queer people, but I genuinely don't understand why this is not like symmetric, right? I think that the queer community is going to help people like anyways, and it's just going to help them do like through other means, right? Like it's going to help them like get auditions in the legit like porn industry or traditional porn industry or whatever, right? I think that basically this is all reliant on the idea that like the traditional porn industry is bad and therefore is derivative of what opening governments say. But I think crucially here also, I think it's crucial to note that all of the celebrities that they talk about and stuff like that are less likely to happen on OnlyFans because the barriers of entry are so low. It means that the market is constantly flooded with a lot of new talent, and therefore it's really hard for any individual person to stand out, which also hits a lot of opening government's material about why this is beneficial for individual queer people, because it's really hard to make any type of revenue because like the revenue is split so many ways because everybody's doing OnlyFans basically, and specifically under their motion. So why are traditional platforms getting better? I think this is very powerful as a piece of substantive because it takes opening government at their best, right? We concede, or even if we concede that there are some problems with the traditional porn industry, like exploitative directors and bad working hours and stuff like that, I think that we're on a trajectory of improvement, and that only happens at the point where the LGBT movement doesn't, like tell people that they shouldn't go to work for like traditional porn industry and stuff like that. In terms of what happens, I think fewer queer people are going to be in traditional porn industries. I think this is crucial here because I think that the opinion of your community matters a lot. Like this is literally your found family. Therefore, psychologically, I think that at the point where your found family is like, oh hey, don't do this thing on Pornhub, that's bad. I think psychologically that is going to be very damaging for you, and therefore you're not going to want to do it. I think that this fills the analytical links in opening opposition and in the debate in general about how psychologically people are not likely to enter this porn industry. But second, I think that the communities just generally lose this focus of the traditional porn industry because the conversation shifts, right? Because now the party line is just don't do Pornhub, right? We're not talking about how companies that upload their videos on Pornhub, like how they're damaging and stuff like that. We're mostly talking about how to get people out of Pornhub, etc. What this means is, firstly, there is less capital to improve the industry as a whole. And I think the LGBT movement is crucial here. And again, this is more important because it's much closer to the motion, right? We're talking about what the LGBT industry, the LGBT movement should do. Firstly, because the LGBT movement has established established networks for activism, right? You have group chats that take people out to protest. You have established links with local politicians. You have like capacities to organize drive-bys and stuff like that in order to promote better legislation that protects people that are working in the traditional porn industry. Second, I think that you have so much more people that are willing to show up, that take activism as their duty and their hobby, and therefore it's much more likely that they're going to be the ones that are going to show up, right? And I think this is crucial because on both sides of the house, like straight people still stay like in Pornhub, right? There are loads of people that are still staying in the traditional porn industry. But why is this crucial then, like relative to regulating OnlyFans, which is the other piece of material that comes up in Closing Government? So why is regulating the traditional porn industry much more important? I mean, trivially, firstly, like opening government literally say that the like you know, the harms that happen in the traditional porn industry are much more serious, right? So they concede that it's much more important to solve these harms as opposed to the harms that happen in terms of OnlyFans. But several more reasons for why this is more important. In terms of the people that are left behind, I think that the people that are likely to choose the traditional porn industry are people that are much more vulnerable. I think that these are people that have pre-existent ties with, like within the traditional porn industry that are built up over time, and people that are not necessarily confident with technology or not necessarily good. Because in order for you to be successful on OnlyFans, you have to be good at like e-commerce and marketing and stuff like that. I think this is likely to be older actors, which are much more vulnerable as like in the porn industry, because they're likely to be the ones that are less likely to be successful over time, because like beauty standards, you know, degrade with age and stuff like that, and therefore they're very like less likely to have any sort of revenue over time. But also there are loads of people that like need guaranteed healthcare maybe because they have a chronic illness or stuff like that. For all those people, you are leaving them behind regulatory wise. You are making it impossible for these people to achieve good work standards and all the problems that we're talking about. But secondly, like the traditional porn industry is and is going to always remain the first place that people go to search for like, you know, porn and stuff like that. I think this is never going to change regardless of what the LGBT movement like talks about, right? Because, you know, like confused, like queer people are always going to go to that when they're barely like coming out and barely discovering their sexuality, because this is what the hegemonic narrative is, and you're not so connected with the LGBT with the LGBT movement in the first place, right? Which then means that for all the reasons that opening government already say about why education is so important, it is so important for these like companies to produce better porn and to like be regulated into respecting their workers more and stuff like that. Opening opposition say that there is an opportunity for regulation to happen, but never explain why that regulation systemically happens at the point where the LGBT movement comes in. We do that in closing opposition, and therefore we take it over. In clashing with closing government, I think that there's already in this, you know, a concession in their opening to say that OnlyFans regulation is less important, and therefore they must also stand for that. They may also agree that regulating the traditional porn industry achieves better impacts for queer people, which I think that that is the most important impact at the end of the day. For all these reasons, I beg you to pause.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I'd now like to welcome Government Whip.
Okay, I'm so sorry. My internet really sucks. So if my voice cuts out at any point, please immediately text in the chat. I'll try and fix it and deal with it. I'm so sorry about this. Okay, so starting in 3, 2, 1. The problem isn't that Pornhub is regulated poorly. The problem is that Pornhub exists entirely. I think what CO misses in this debate crucially are things like power dynamics, crucially are things like somebody else controlling the way you present your body and profiting off of it while you get a cut or a simple percentage of it. I think the problem is fundamentally the idea of a pimp. It's not necessarily that we can have better contracts and like more people. It's always going to be white men that want to control women's bodies, that choose to take these women in and try to like present them in whatever way they want to present them. Have all the regulations you want, you will still not win this debate, because the problem is of the structure in and of itself, not of the fact that there's less regulation. Let's talk to you then about the two issues in this debate. One, 1, in which world do queer people have more ownership over their bodies and experiences? 2, where do we have greater political advocacy? Let's talk about 1. I'm going to very quickly knock OO out of this round. One thing they say, so the first thing they say is, we don't want to make value judgments as a queer community, and this somehow like takes away from other experiences, and they don't really want sexual hypervisibility. Let's talk about all of this. OG gives you a very baseline response where they say, well, you know, we can do both. We tell you no. Sex work and the queer community are inextricably linked. Survival sex work and everything Jeffrey told you is very, very relevant, especially when it comes to BIPOC and POC communities. Why is that? Because a lot of us come from like very conservative households. If my parents found out anything about my sexuality, I would very much be on the streets the very next day and try to have to figure out a way to earn money. That's why you need to understand that it's not about like, oh, should we take a stance on OnlyFans or not? The problem is that people opting for sex work within the queer community is going to exist on either side of the house. The issue then is what do we as the queer community advocate for? This is where we add to OG's model and say, no, we're not just going to make some broad statements. We want queer activists to actively promote the accounts on OnlyFans of other queer people and queer users. We literally want to promote those accounts so those people can get more money because those people deserve that money. A lot of those people are like immigrants who come from other countries seeking asylum because they're not protected in their own countries. All of these things are super relevant. So you can't say that this debate is not about like amateur porn versus regular porn, because fundamentally that is the dichotomy that exists. As the queer community, we need to pick one. We need to create awareness for that one and make sure that that's where we're directing people to, because those are the people that need our help the most. Okay. Secondly, they say sexual hypervisibility. Again, even in regular porn happens anyway. The categories of Latina lesbians, categories of Black gay men, that like hypersexualized, also racialized, these categories exist within regular porn. The idea then is if hypervisibility already exists in a sexual form, the question is, which one do we endorse? Again, when deciding that, I think in that dichotomy, we have to pick OnlyFans because that is where they control more of their content. Okay, they say 3, legal infrastructure is what necessarily protects these people. Why? They have contracts, regulation on underage people, and also that there's no political will to regulate OnlyFans. I'm going to respond to all 3. 1, contracts. I think OG already gave you analysis on why those contracts aren't good to begin with. But secondly, we told you it's not that contracts are bad, it's that there's a contract in the first place. There is a power dynamic between you and the director and all of his cameramen that are standing around you, taking a video of you, telling you how to move your body, where to place yourself, and how to have sex. I think that kind of power dynamic is something we're against, even if you make better contracts. In our world, it's better because maybe it's going to be you having sex with your partner where your best friend is recording you. I think that kind of setting is the best kind of setting where you don't need a contract because you're in a comfortable environment, not with 10 men holding cameras looking at you all weird. I think that is a world that we rather support. 2, they say regulation on underage people, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's cool, but we do know that Pornhub has already had scandals of underage kids posting their videos. There's already scandals of revenge porn being posted on Pornhub that they took so long to take down to the point where half of the world had already saved those videos. That means that your regulations don't work either. I understand that CO gives us like analysis on there can be more regulation. We don't really get an idea of what that looks like and how that makes any of these things any better. Finally, they say you have unethical consumers and there's coercion, you have predators. This is, again, an uncomparative thing to say, because Jeffrey tells you here that power dynamics are different when there's one director that controls how you present yourself versus multiple loyal consumers that you have, in which if some person is asking you something to do which you don't want to do, you have the ability to say no because you have so many other people that are on your website that are willing to pay you for your services. I think given that, you just generally have way more autonomy than you would have in their world. So as far as like legal infrastructures and those protections go, we necessarily take this debate because we're telling you that it's not necessarily about legality. It's about the fact that there is another person that controls what you put out into the world, and that another person that decides how long it stays on there, and also another person that decides what cut of the profits you get. I think this is where it becomes crucially important, Jeffrey's idea of income redistribution. That's why we talk to you about racialized groups and the way that they're presented in regular mainstream porn. And the idea then is that we have like the flow of money going into queer spaces spaces. Why is that good? This is where I talk to you about our second issue. Where do we have greater political advocacy? This is crucial to this round, and I think this is where we win the debate, because advocacy is the most important thing that the LGBTQ plus community is to support, because that is how we get our rights. That is how we present ourselves. That is how we get people to rally behind our causes. That's good. That's better than what OG told you, because this is where we're bringing you actual on the ground impacts. What do we tell you then? First, we talk to you about survival sex work, something I've already discussed. Second thing we talk to you about is again something I don't really think that CO really responded to, other than just mitigation. They said, well, a queer community is going to help you anyway. They can get you auditions for like the porn industry as it goes. Again, I've already told you we don't want those auditions. Those auditions suck. But also, we think the point about how a lot of these people, they have Twitter and Instagram personas with large followings, because these are like strong, independent women with their OnlyFans and their lesbian followings, who are also very like proactive and have political causes. They also have loyal consumers, because let's be clear, there's many, like so many simps on OnlyFans that are willing to do anything for these women and anything for these queer people. Why is that good? Because that means that on their followings like Twitter and Instagram, where their consumers are also based, that means they can post issues or like post the GoFundMe accounts of other queer people that need help. That means like a lot of drag queens that are OnlyFans have like collective funds, where this money can then flow into those collective funds and then actively help their community. That also means that you get to like inform more people and rally them around your causes, because you have such a loyal customer base. I think all of these things are crucial. They're unique from opening, and things that actively take down every single thing that CO and OO has told you in this round. For all those reasons, I'm very proud to stand on the side that stands for queer people's control and autonomy over their own bodies. Very proud to propose.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I'd now like to welcome the opposition whip.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
I would prefer POIs if like a visual thing, but I'll try and take one in the chat anyway. If you don't, so it should be fine. Cool. I'm starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to deal first of all with closing government, and then I'm going to weigh us off against our opening, and then go on to opening government at the end. Cool. I think like the thing about just to get straight into their case, I think first of all they talk about like you're going to get more capital because you're able to get this, and this is like where the advocacy of the queer community is so important, right? Because this is how we get our rights and things like that. But I think this clashes directly with Julie's case when she tells you that like, look, the sex industry, the traditional and the amateur one, is going to exist on both sides of the house in both cases either way, right? Just because the LGBT community decides to celebrate amateur porns particularly does not mean the traditional industry just disappears overnight, right? People still engage in those things, and that is what is really important. I think the people who still particularly engage, like it shouldn't fool efficacy that because the community celebrates this, every LGBT person goes and creates and watches only amateur stuff. I think that is an unrealistic thing, because I think first of all, as Julia's already told you, young people still watch stuff from the traditional thing because everybody knows what Pornhub is, and you're likely when you're a young queer person to just immediately go into Pornhub because first of all it's free, but everyone knows about it, and just see like whatever is trending. So I think that's it. But also, first of all, like straight people are still always going to be part of this industry and watching this industry. And I think what happens about those sex workers in that place is also really important, because I think that like obviously why we all obviously care about the queer community here. This is not an act motion, it is a belief set motion. So is what is the aggregate like best utility and what has the best impacts for everyone overall. And I think that is why we take the debate, because Julie tells you why the LGBT community, specifically in the traditional industry, doing advocacy there gets better workers' rights for all sex workers, no matter their gender, race, sexuality, or orientation or anything like that. And I think that's why it's more important. But I think then like this is why also like I think closing government doesn't really like get to the point, because I think when they talk about like survival sex workers being so key to like the LGBT community as well, I think Julie already deals with this when she tells you that like, oh, but these people are going to be in the sex community, the sex work industry either way, so celebrating or not doesn't really matter too much. But I also think when they talk about like income redistribution and like uplifting these people, I don't know why the LGBT community cannot like support things like much more radical leftist policies and better working rights and conditions, unemployment benefits and income redistribution in that way. I don't know why we immediately go, oh, these people are poor because of like their marginalized sexuality and stuff like that. We should solve the sex industry. There's so many other alternatives that the LGBT community could do comparatively. I think then like the stuff on the like, then they then try to fix the link from opening government, which is like the difference between like particularly amateur industry is things like you pay-per-view and you have subscribers rather than just random viewers. And it's this specific link which I think like is probably something OG does miss. And this is why you're not going to pander to straight men and stuff like this, because you're you're trying to make the relationship with your community and that base of followers. But I think the problem is that straight people are still going to watch LGBTQ content because of like fetishization and horrible things like that, right? And I think the thing is that when they're like, oh, you can then now do advocacy and stuff like that because you have that relationship with them. I think advocacy is so difficult and a really exhausting thing to burn, and it's very easy to burn out for because you're always having to fight and prove your rights. But I also think this is a massive turnoff to a lot of straight people who are watching you. I don't think they start to watch you and then you start talking about politics. I think a lot of them just leave. And I think this is also a key thing that Julie also brings up, is that especially amateur porn industry, because the barriers of entry are so low, it's so absolutely competitive. I think the moment you start talking about advocacy and LGBT rights, they just leave you and immediately go and find some other creator that won't do this. I think like closing government says, oh, they know they cannot compete with like heteronormative other people, but I think they absolutely think they can, because I think when you're like literal rent, your income depends on this. You're much more likely to just like, go fold on your values and just like do what the straight white man does, because that's probably the majority of your viewers, right? Because they still make up the majority of the population, because you know you're going to get more fucking money from them, and now you can pay more rent or you can buy nicer clothes. And these are all very tangible things, which I think in a psychological mindset, when you're working day to day in the sex industry, you're just likely to buy you over to make you fold on these views. Cool. I think then they say like, yeah, and they talk about like, yeah, okay. So they then talk, yeah, I think then this is the government whip does a lot about like, the contracts in the first place of what we're again. And this is still bad, but I think I've already discussed about like why Pornhub still exists and the traditional industry still always exists. I think then also furthermore in the political advocacy point that they make, I think that like even when they do have like a large following, for example, like I don't know why a lot of people, specifically straight people who this is like what like you probably want to tell this to, I don't know why they watch you on OnlyFans and then go and follow you on Instagram and Twitter, especially if you are talking about political advocacy and retweeting things like GoFundMe's and stuff like that. I think they just get bored and unfollow you. So I think the people who continue to follow you are probably already other LGBT people, and you then you're in an echo chamber, you're preaching to the converted. I don't think that advocacy reaches nearly as many people as closing government wants to say it does. Cool. The reason I think we take it over opening opposition then is I think that like the top half is really tight when they say like, one side you have more autonomy, more regulation, and what is off on, right? Because I think the other thing about top half is that both of them assume that even if the creators do go to the amateur platform, they assume the viewers will too. But I think Julie tells you specifically why this is not the case. And even if there are amateur sections on other places, why that's not a good thing. And why it is not a good thing in the first place for creators to go, despite all the problems with the sex industry. Yeah, I'm going to go into opening government now. Cool. I think that, like, first of all, they talk, but like, even if all of their stuff about why the porn industry is really bad, and like the traditional porn industry is really bad is true, I think there's still trade-offs in the amateur one. Like, I think, for example, like you have contracts and you have safety things, all the stuff that OO says, I'm not going to whip exactly what they said, but I think then the stuff about like, like when you're being like, you're forced into these things because you're like straight white men want you to do like scissoring and stuff like this. I think this still happens, right? Because there's still a massive market for like lesbian and gay porn, right? That other people and straight people who fetishize this stuff watch, right? But now instead of an LGBT person doing it, it is a straight person doing it. I'll take the point from OG. Go ahead.
So by CO's own analysis, most LGBTQIA people will leave. So their burden is that the community, the specific community, has a stronger obligation for those that stay, as opposed to the many people of many races who will be actively damaged by a lack of celebration.
No, but this is the point, right? It is a believes that motion. It's not just that this house as the LGBT community. So even if there is some duty or you do get slightly better benefits on your side, which I don't think is always necessarily proven because of all of OO's analysis, I think that like there's now a bigger impact because we help all people in the sex industry. Because I think the thing is that like, because you're now just going to have straight actors being in lesbian pornos and stuff like, and horrible and like stuff like that, right? So I think like, and this is what people see, right? Because I think this is especially what young LGBT people see because this is their first interaction with porn. And I think that is incredibly damaging. I think then at least like even if you have bad directors who try and coerce you and stuff, because of the links that Julia's told you about why the LGBT people, because they have already been activized, being tried to be activists for their entire life and they have these things, they are getting better and improving rights in the sex industry. I also think when you're actually a gay like person in the sex industry and a director tells you to do something, you can just go like casually, no one actually does that. Whereas on the comparative on their side, when it is a straight person doing like a gay act or something like that, they don't know what it is and they just go along with it. I think that's much worse representation. I think especially for like how straight people view the LGBT community, because also obviously the community also cares about that because since they are the majority and the biggest voting bloc and stuff like that. And I think when straight people consume a less realistic, more objectifying, more fetishization way of the like they have a worse view of the community as a whole, and that is so much worse for everyone. I think then like talking about like better reflection of sex and cleaning stuff like that, I just think this is the same thing about the advocacy. I don't know why you do this. I think that's probably a bit of a turnoff. Even if you talk about sex positivity, I don't think this necessarily comes into your videos and people aren't just going to consume that because they like your content. I think, yeah, I don't think that really stands. So proud to oppose.